He woke up at 5:30 a.m., like he always had, for decades without fail. Not because anyone told him to, but because discipline was something Walter Briggs carried with pride, long after the uniform was folded away. A retired Army sergeant, Walter didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want pity. All he wanted was to care for his wife, Elaine, who now relied on him for everything: her breath, her comfort, her survival. So when a cold bank policy denied him access to his own pension, money he desperately needed for her life-saving medication, he didn't yell. He didn't demand. He sat quietly in the lobby, defeated but not broken, gripping a pamphlet that had replaced human decency. But what the bank didn't know was that Walter had one number left to call. A card he had carried for over a decade, given to him by a man who once said, "If the system ever fails someone, it was meant to protect. You call me." What happened next would not only restore Walter's dignity, but change an entire banking system forever. This is not just a story about a frozen account. It's a story about duty, about quiet sacrifice, and about what it truly means to stand up for someone when no one else will. Walter Briggs stood at the bank counter, his hands gripping the edge a little tighter than usual. The air was sterile, too cold, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Across from him, the young teller didn't lift her eyes from her screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Briggs, but there's a temporary hold on your account due to internal security protocols. We can't process any transactions at this time," she said flatly, sliding a glossy pamphlet across the counter without a glance. Walter, 79 and not one for dramatics, blinked hard to keep himself from reacting. He wasn't a man given to outbursts. He was a retired Army sergeant, the kind of man who faced emergencies with discipline, not panic. But right now, all he could think about was Elaine, his wife of 42 years, waiting at home for medication they could no longer afford to delay. Her breathing had been worse this week. She needed the meds today, not tomorrow, not after protocols, today. "Security protocols," he repeated, voice strained but steady. "This is my pension. It was just deposited. That's money for my wife's medicine." The teller only offered a weak shrug, nudging the useless pamphlet closer as if that somehow compensated for the bureaucratic wall he had just hit. Minutes later, Walter sat silently on the wooden bench in the bank's lobby. He stared at the floor tiles, his back straight but his spirit bent. No yelling, no scene, just a quiet, growing sense of defeat curling in his gut, like winter wind through an old window. Then the glass doors whooshed open. A gust of energy swept into the room. A man in a sharply cut dark suit entered with brisk, confident strides, eyes scanning, jaw clenched. Graham Kessler, the CEO of New Liberty Bank. He saw Walter immediately, locked eyes with him, and without a word turned on his heel toward the branch manager's office. His expression was thunderous, and the sudden shift in the room's energy was undeniable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A hush fell across the lobby like a curtain being drawn. People didn't usually notice Walter Briggs. He was the kind of man who moved through life without fanfare. He didn't wear his uniform outside the house, didn't decorate his car with bumper stickers, or show up at parades wearing medals. But those who truly knew Walter, his few loyal friends, mostly veterans themselves, understood one simple truth. This was a man who had given everything for his country. He'd served in the Army for over 30 years, not in glamorous roles, not on the front pages. Most of his time was spent behind the scenes, coordinating supply chains, stabilizing logistics, moving critical resources across dangerous terrain, lifelines that kept combat units alive. He had risen quietly, methodically, to the rank of senior master sergeant, not because he sought authority, but because others trusted him to lead with steadiness and without ego. Now, in the twilight of his life, Walter lived with Elaine in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The walls were plain, the furniture mismatched, but everything had its place. The space was clean, carefully arranged, just like Walter's thoughts. Elaine's COPD had gotten worse over the years. Their once lively routines had been replaced by a rhythm of oxygen tanks, medication schedules, and carefully timed meals. Walter took on the caretaking without complaint. He adjusted, because that's what soldiers do. Every cent of his pension was accounted for. Rent, electricity, medication, groceries, no indulgences, no spare change for trips or new clothes. If something tore, he patched it. If something ran out, he waited. He clipped coupons, hunted pharmacy discounts, and borrowed books from thrift shops instead of spending money on entertainment. The VA couldn't cover everything, especially not the new medications that helped Elaine breathe easier. So Walter filled in the gaps with discipline, the same kind of planning that once kept battalions functioning in a war zone. Even now, with no commanding officer and no schedule to follow, Walter still rose every morning at 5:30. He made the bed with precision, laid out Elaine's pills, brewed one pot of coffee, and opened his ledger notebook. On graph paper with a ruler and a mechanical pencil, he tracked every expense, every dollar, every cent. His sense of pride wasn't rooted in possessions. It came from knowing he had done right by what little he had. To the people in his neighborhood, he was just an old man who walked the same route every week. He didn't advertise his military history. No pins, no hats, no grand speeches. If someone held the door open for him, he gave a simple nod. If asked about his past, he'd offer a faint smile and say, "Just did my part." That's why today hit harder than it should have. It wasn't just about a bank policy. It wasn't even the frustration of the young teller who couldn't be bothered to look him in the eye. It was something deeper. This moment felt like a dismissal of everything Walter Briggs had lived by. His service, his routine, his preparation, his quiet, consistent dignity. He had followed the rules. He had done what he was supposed to. And now, at a moment when he needed support the most, the system he had spent his life supporting had turned its back on him. For the first time in years, Walter found himself unsure of what to do next. It was the first Tuesday of the month. It had always been this way. Rain or shine, Walter Briggs walked the same stretch of sidewalk from his apartment to the corner branch of New Liberty Bank, nestled between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. He had no reason to expect anything different today. And yet, today had betrayed him. Walter never needed GPS reminders or calendar alerts. His body moved in tune with a rhythm that had been carved into him over decades. At exactly 7:02 a.m. every month, his military pension appeared in his bank account, never a minute late. And by 9 a.m. and 1 a.m., without fail, Walter Marzer would be standing at the counter of New Liberty Bank, ready to withdraw precisely what he and his wife, Elaine, had waited to get through the month. No more, no less. He wasn't a man of excess or impulse. His monthly withdrawal, $400, not a dollar over, covered their groceries, co-pays for Elaine's medications, and left just a bit of cushion for small, unplanned emergencies. He didn't rely on debit cards or mobile apps, not because he didn't know how to use them, but because he had seen how quickly systems could fail. A $20 bill in his hand gave him a kind of grounded certainty that glowing numbers on a screen never could. That morning had begun just like all the others. He wore his familiar olive field jacket, zipped halfway, the fabric softened by years of wear. In his chest pocket, a small notepad with a handwritten list reminded him what to pick up at the store after the bank. But unlike other mornings, Walter carried a quiet urgency beneath his calm. Elaine had had a rough night. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Her doctor had prescribed a new inhaler just the day before, one that came with a price tag that couldn't wait. Walter never said much, not out loud, but he knew deep in his gut that this morning's visit mattered more than usual. As he stepped inside a New Liberty Bank, the familiar aroma of lobby coffee greeted him, bitter but warm and oddly comforting. He walked to the counter, expecting to see Margaret, the kind-hearted teller in her 50s who always asked about Elaine, but instead, standing stiff and impersonal behind the glass, was someone new. A young man with rigid posture and a clipped demeanor. His name tag read Travis. Walter gave a polite nod, slid his ID withdrawal slip across the counter, and spoke in his usual calm voice. "Morning, I'd like to withdraw $400 from my account." Travis didn't acknowledge the greeting. He was already typing, eyes fixed on the screen. His fingers moved quickly, but his expression darkened. He frowned and muttered, barely audible. Then, with no eye contact, he said flatly, "Looks like there's a temporary hold on your account, sir." Walter straightened, instinctively alert. "A hold? My pension came in this morning, same as always." "Yes, sir." I do see the deposit, Travis replied, still focused on the screen. But the system flagged it for an automatic security hold. Could be routine. Might have been triggered during last night's processing update. Walter blinked, trying to make sense of it. So, what does that mean? I can't access my money? Not until the hold clears, Travis said, his tone mechanical. It's part of our fraud prevention protocols. Nothing I can override from this terminal. Walter's hands tightened slightly on the counter's edge. This isn't some wire transfer from a foreign bank, he said, steady but firm. It's my pension. I've received it every month for decades. My wife needs her medication. Today. I understand, sir, I really do, Travis said with the same rehearsed tone. Without looking up, he reached under the counter and slid a folded pamphlet across the surface. Thin paper with a customer service number printed in tiny type on the back. You can call this number. They might be able to explain more. Walter looked down at the brochure, then back up at Travis. No apology, no effort, no options, just policy. That's when it hit him. None of this, not the decades he'd served, not the urgency of this morning, not even Elaine's suffering, meant anything to the system. Or to Travis. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the worthless brochure back on the counter. He didn't want to raise his voice, didn't want to cause a scene. That wasn't his way. But this mattered too much to stay silent. My wife, he said, voice low but unmistakably firm, has advanced lung disease. The doctor prescribed a new inhaler. It costs almost $400 up front. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for what's already mine. Travis finally looked up, just for a moment. His face remained blank, untouched by the words. It was the kind of detachment that came from training, to shield against emotion, to not get involved. I understand your concern, sir, he repeated, but the system locked the account due to a security flag. It's bank policy. There's nothing I can do from this terminal. Walter's jaw tightened. Bank policy? He repeated, trying to contain the mix of disbelief and anger rising inside him. Travis nodded slightly, eyes already returning to the next screen. You're welcome to wait for the hold to lift. It usually clears within 48 business hours. That could mean 4 actual days, Walter said, his voice now taut with frustration. She doesn't have 4 days. I'm sorry, Travis replied, the words automatic, robotic. There was no apology in his tone. He gestured vaguely toward the waiting area. You can sit over there if you like. Walter took in a slow breath, the kind that settled heavy in the chest. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pound the counter, didn't demand to speak with someone higher up. He just nodded once, not in agreement with the bank teller, Travis, but in resignation. A quiet acknowledgement of reality. No one here was going to help him. He turned from the counter and made his way slowly to the bench near the front entrance. His boots echoed faintly against the polished tile floor, which somehow felt colder than usual today. He lowered himself onto the bench with effort, the weight of frustration and quiet despair adding to the gravity. He leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees, hands lightly clasped, and then he simply sat there, silent. In his lap was a bright little brochure, one of those generic things people pass around without thought. The font was small, almost mocking, and the colors far too cheerful for someone who'd just been told that his account was frozen. All he could see in his mind was the infuriating loop of automated prompts, the mechanical voice reminding him how important his call was while keeping him on hold for 30 minutes. Eventually, some underpaid stranger would read him the policy script, never hearing the fear behind his words. Human empathy had been replaced by procedure. Walter could feel it. He had been erased from the system he once served. He closed his eyes and Elaine's face came rushing back, her breathing, shallow, labored. Her shoulders so thin now, barely rising and falling beneath her blanket. The way she always said we, even when she meant I. The faint, tremulous smile when she asked if he'd be able to pick up her medication today. It was that thought, her voice, her trust, that lit a spark somewhere deep in his memory. A name, a number. It had been years, more than a decade, maybe closer to 15 since he'd thought of it. It was during his time on the Joint Civilian-Military Disaster Response Program. Back then, he'd worked logistics, coordinating emergency supply chains and mobilizations for the National Disaster Protocol Team. He remembered the briefing, the simulations, the faces. One of them, just a kid really but sharp, had pulled him aside after one long, difficult exercise. If the system ever really fails, the young officer had said, handing him a card, I mean fails the people it's supposed to protect, call this number. It's direct. Last resort only. Walter had chuckled at the time, more out of habit than skepticism, but he'd tucked the card into his field notebook just the same. Years passed, the notebook aged, but the card stayed, more out of respect than hope. Now, in this sterile lobby, surrounded by silence and indifference, Walter slowly reached into his coat. His fingers found the old flip phone, scratched, worn, dependable, just like him. Then he opened his battered leather wallet. Tucked deep behind receipts and folded grocery lists, he found it. The card had yellowed with age, and the ink was fading, but one name still stood firm: Graham Kessler, Emergency Liaison, Treasury and Infrastructure Task Force. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. Back then, Graham had been one of the youngest in the room, a razor-smart financial analyst with a calm voice and eyes that caught every moment. Walter had respected him immediately. Despite their age difference, they'd worked well together. No ego, just the mission. At the end of the final drill, Graham had handed Walter this card and said, if the system ever fails someone, and I mean really fails, don't call me unless it matters. Walter had kept that card not for what it offered, but because of what it represented: integrity, responsibility, a line in the sand. Now here he was, hovering over the keypad, doubt creeping in. People like Graham Kessler didn't pick up random calls. They had layers, assistants, gatekeepers, protocols. The world didn't just let you reach a man like that anymore. But this wasn't a favor. This wasn't about cutting in line. This was for Elaine. He dialed. It rang once. Kessler, came the voice, calm, firm, and unmistakable. Walter swallowed. Graham, it's Walter. Walter Briggs, Senior Master Sergeant, retired. We served together on Crimson Watch. You gave me a number. Said to call if the system ever... Walter Briggs, Graham cut in. Then a beat of silence, followed by a shift in his tone, recognition breaking through. Good Lord, it's been, what, 15 years? Are you all right? Walter exhaled. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. I wouldn't be calling if I were. I'm sitting in the lobby of New Liberty Bank. My pension came through this morning, same as always, but they've frozen my account because of some system-wide update. My wife's medication is waiting at the pharmacy, and the words trailed off, but the urgency was clear. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about someone who'd done everything right, someone who had served, followed the rules, kept his head down, and was now being quietly crushed by the very system he once helped hold up. Walter waited, and Graham Kessler, on the other end of that line, listened. Graham's voice cut through the heavy air with deliberate calm, every syllable carved with authority. This flag should never have affected veteran disbursements, he said. It was part of a flawed patch pushed live last night, an error in judgment, not finance. He turned to look directly at Delaney, his tone measured but cold. Tell me, why wasn't this caught? Delaney opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly flustered. I had just returned from a training conference. I wasn't aware there had been a patch deployed. Graham didn't blink. And yet your staff took no initiative to investigate. They told Mr. Briggs his account was frozen and offered no solution. Travis shifted uncomfortably, color draining from his face. I didn't know what to do, he mumbled. The system flagged it. You thought, Graham interrupted, eyes now fixed on him. That protocol mattered more than common sense, than human decency. Walter said nothing. He stood still, his eyes unreadable, but his jaw was tight. Graham exhaled slowly, folding his arms. You have a decorated veteran, an elderly man denied access to his own pension for medical care. That's not just poor service. That's negligence. Delaney's voice was brittle. Mr. Kessler, I assure you, we'll fix this right away. No, Graham said, cutting her off. You won't, I will. He turned toward Walter. Mr. Briggs, I apologize on behalf of this institution. Your funds will be fully released today. You'll also receive a formal letter of apology signed by me personally, and will be conducting a full internal review of this branch's practices." Walter gave a slow nod, emotion barely visible beneath his composed exterior. "Thank you," he said quietly. Graham took a step closer, lowering his voice. "No, Walter, thank you for everything you've given to this country. The least we can do is give you what's already yours without making you fight for it." Travis looked down, shame tightening his expression. Delaney busied herself with typing, her hands trembling slightly. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the HVAC and the faint clack of the clipboard under Graham's assistant's fingers. "I want a compliance report on my desk by tomorrow morning," Graham said as he turned to leave. "And the teller training manual rewritten, effective immediately." "Yes, sir," Delaney stammered. As they exited the office, the lobby outside resumed its normal rhythm. Soft conversations, papers shuffling, the quiet whirl of machines. But something had shifted. Heads turned with newfound respect as Graham passed by, and when Walter followed, it was as if a quiet honor walked with him. At the front doors, Graham paused, extending his hand again. "Take care of yourself, Walter." Walter met his eyes. "You too, Graham. You always did know when to show up." They shook once more. Then Graham stepped out into the daylight, his assistant and security detail in step behind him. Walter stood still for a moment longer. The weight on his shoulders eased just slightly, not because the money had come through, but because someone had remembered that behind every flag was a life, a sacrifice, a man. This morning, Mr. Walter Briggs walked into the bank branch quietly, the same one he had been visiting for years, to withdraw a portion of his monthly pension, money he had earned through 30 years of dedicated military service. But today, something was different. He was told without warning or compassion that he could not access his own funds because of an automatic system flag. He calmly explained that the withdrawal was urgent. He needed to buy medication for his wife, Elaine. Instead of help, he was handed a brochure. Walter turned to the nearest staff member. "Is that correct?" he asked, his voice steady but wounded. Travis, a young banker, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, sir," he admitted. "That's the policy. I couldn't override the hold." "Did you escalate the issue?" Came a sharper voice. Graham Kessler, the CEO of Liberty Corp, who had arrived quietly during the commotion. Travis's throat tightened. I I didn't know how. I just followed the script." Graham's eyes darkened. He turned to Miss Delaney, the branch manager, his tone clipped and precise. "And you, Miss Delaney, did you train your staff on Directive 7B, Paragraph 4, the one that outlines escalation procedures for pension account flags, especially those tied to veteran benefits?" Her face paled. I don't recall that section specifically." "Then you failed," he interrupted, his voice leaving no room for excuse. "You are the gatekeeper of this branch. When your staff can't help a man like Walter Briggs, a man who's given more to this country than most of us ever will, then this bank hasn't just failed in service. It has failed in humanity." The silence was suffocating. Graham turned back to Walter. "Mr. Briggs, your funds are available immediately. I've personally removed the hold on your account. Furthermore, your wife's medication, not just today, but for the next 12 months, will be paid in full through my discretionary account. It's the very least we can do." Walter's lips parted slightly. The weight of the offer stunned him. "You didn't have to do that." "I absolutely did," Graham said firmly. "Because this," he gestured around the room, "this is what happens when people hide behind policy instead of stepping up." He turned back to Delaney and Travis. "Expect a full audit of this branch's training procedures. You'll both be part of a mandatory retraining program, effective immediately." No one protested. There was nothing left to say. Walter stood in quiet dignity as Graham made a few swift, authoritative phone calls. The icy grip of red tape melted in moments. The hold on his account vanished. A red banner lit up across the internal system screen. Immediate access authorized by CEO. His account was reclassified as veteran priority. Miss Delaney, still visibly shaken, printed the withdrawal slip herself. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood across the counter, her voice low and laced with guilt. "I've processed your withdrawal, Mr. Briggs," she said quietly, "and I sincerely apologize for what happened this morning. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Walter nodded once. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His life had already said enough. His uniform may have long been folded away, but his sacrifices were still written in the fine lines around his eyes and the silence in his posture. The weight of failure didn't rest on him. It rested on those who had failed him. While Delaney completed the paperwork, Graham stepped beside him once more. "I meant what I said," he told Walter, his voice resolute. "Elaine's medication costs, all of them, will be covered for the next year. One of my senior staff from the executive office will handle it directly. You won't deal with hold music or pamphlets again." Walter raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "That's generous." Graham gave a slight nod. "It's not generosity, it's justice, and it's long overdue." For a few quiet seconds, the two men stood together. Two soldiers, one from a war decades ago, the other still battling the modern war of bureaucracy, but both cut from the same cloth. They didn't need words to understand each other. Some things in life are earned, not given. By the end of the business day, Walter's story had traveled far beyond the walls of that branch. Whispers became headlines across Liberty Corp's internal network, and then came the memo. A company-wide directive, personally signed by Graham Kessler, arrived in every manager's inbox. The subject line was simple, uncompromising. Veterans are not just customers. They are commitments. The body of the message was even sharper. Any failure to serve our veteran clients with urgency, respect, and flexibility will result in immediate corrective action. Veterans are not policy problems. They are the reason this company exists in the country we call home. Any system that cannot adapt to their needs is a system that must be restructured. Staff meetings were called, emergency retraining modules were uploaded. Across every branch, conversations were no longer about quotas or call times, but about dignity, sacrifice, and honor. Because on that day, one quiet veteran, armed with nothing but his calm resolve and a lifetime of service, reminded a corporation what it truly means to serve. Travis, the young bank teller, was placed under internal review, not out of cruelty or punishment, but as part of a necessary reckoning. He had followed the script, yes, but he'd failed at something far more vital. Listening. The incident wasn't swept under the rug. Instead, it became a pivotal moment. He was sent home for 2 weeks, and when he returned, it wouldn't be to the same routine. Travis was enrolled in a mentorship program, one personally overseen by a senior advisor who had served in the Navy, someone who understood service, honor, and the quiet dignity of those who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Ms. Delaney, the manager who had mishandled the situation with cold indifference, was reassigned. Not fired, but redirected. She entered an executive retraining initiative and was temporarily placed with Liberty Corp's newly formed Veteran Liaison Department. There, she'd gained firsthand experience working with vulnerable clients, the kind whose stories couldn't be captured by numbers alone. It was an uncomfortable pivot, but a necessary one. Walter never asked for any of this. He never demanded apologies or looked for compensation. He never raised his voice or sought to shame anyone. He had simply stood his ground, quietly and with resolve. After the ordeal, he walked out of the bank with the $400 in his pocket, not as a windfall, but as a responsibility fulfilled. He boarded the next city bus home. Elaine was waiting, her new medication finally ready at the pharmacy, and a warm meal gently simmering on the stove. When Walter stepped off the bus, the sun had just begun its descent, casting a golden glow over the sidewalks of their neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the first whispers of winter. But Walter didn't notice the chill. In his left hand, he clutched a small, white pharmacy bag, plain, unremarkable, yet holding the most important thing he could have brought home that day. Elaine's medication. He climbed the stairs slowly, 3 flights up. His legs ached, not from exertion, but from the weight of the day. It hadn't been physically demanding, but emotionally it had worn him down. The quiet shame of being dismissed, the helplessness of sitting in that bank lobby, and the unexpected shift caused by a single phone call, they still echoed faintly in his chest. The apartment was just as he had left it, modest, tidy, filled with the gentle presence of home. Elaine was in her usual chair by the window, a blanket draped over her legs, the soft hiss of her oxygen machine breaking the silence. As Walter entered, she looked up immediately, her eyes going straight to the bag in his hand. "You got it?" she asked, her voice low. "I got it," he said, walking to her side and placing the bag gently in her lap. She didn't smile broadly. She didn't have the strength for that anymore. But her eyes glimmered with quiet relief. That was all Walter needed. He could see the gratitude in her face, feel the unspoken bond between them, and it filled the room more than any words ever could. "What happened at the bank?" she asked after a moment, her voice more curious than concerned. Walter paused. "They made it right," he said simply. And that was all. She didn't pry further. After 42 years of marriage, Elaine knew when to ask and when to let silence carry the meaning. That night, they had a small dinner. Nothing extravagant, just enough. Elaine took her first dose of the new medication. For the first time in nights, she fell asleep without a coughing fit. Walter sat beside her, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Peace, for now, had returned. The next morning, Walter woke early as always. He brewed coffee, unfolded the paper, and something caught his eye. A headline from a business news site. Liberty Corp launches veteran priority access program after CEO responds to mishandled case. The article detailed a sweeping new policy. Across all branches of the bank, changes were being made. A dedicated hotline for veteran clients, streamlined escalation procedures, and mandatory staff training focused on handling federal disbursements, pensions, benefits, emergency assistance. Every employee, regardless of position, would be required to complete a course in veteran sensitivity and emergency response by the end of the quarter. Walter's name wasn't mentioned. There were no dramatic call-outs or headlines about him. And that was just fine by him. He hadn't gone through all this for recognition. He hadn't taken a stand for attention or glory. He had done it for one reason: to take care of Elaine. To make sure the system remembered that his service, and the service of millions of others, was more than a line item in a database. As he sat in his kitchen, steam rising from a chipped mug of coffee, he considered how rare it was for those in power to act, not after lawsuits, not under pressure from viral outrage, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He thought about Graham Kessler, the man who had picked up the phone and listened. Not every veteran had someone like that. Not everyone had a voice loud enough to carry up the chain. And that was what stayed with him the most. Walter mattered most. But how many others had stood at that same counter, denied the help they desperately needed, with no one truly hearing them? How many quietly turned away, their shoulders heavy with the weight of feeling unseen, dismissed, unimportant, left to believe that their urgency wasn't urgent enough? It only took one man, one quiet act of resistance, to challenge that indifference. That moment wouldn't rewrite all the broken parts of the system. It wouldn't thaw every frozen account or push life-saving medication into every waiting hand. But it mattered. It cracked the surface. It proved that even in a world ruled by automation, protocol, and cold efficiency, human hearts still beat behind the desks and screens. And sometimes, it only takes one heart refusing to look away to remind the rest what it truly means to serve. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a veteran locked out of his bank account. It wasn't just about a delayed prescription. It was about something far deeper. It was about how a machine-like system, built in the name of speed and convenience, can so easily lose the very thing it should protect: compassion. Walter Briggs gave everything to his country, and yet when he needed help, someone flipping through a binder or following a screen prompt told him, "There's nothing we can do." He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He never once raised his voice. But somehow his calm presence, the quiet dignity in his eyes, spoke louder than any angry outburst ever could. It reached us. He taught us something we forget too easily in today's high-speed world. Real respect isn't about titles or medals or grand gestures. It's how we treat people when no one is watching, especially when they're at their lowest, when they feel powerless, overlooked, or forgotten. Today, we rely so much on efficiency, on policies, apps, and algorithms. But when we let those tools replace empathy, when we stop seeing the human being on the other side of the counter, we lose something priceless. That's especially true for our elders, for the veterans who carried us through wars, who laid the foundation we now walk on. They shouldn't have to fight one more battle just to be seen. So now we ask you, have you witnessed a moment when someone was failed by a system that forgot they were human? Do you believe organizations should be held accountable when they forget who they serve? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's listen. Let's learn. Let's remind each other that even the smallest voices, the softest stands, can spark something bigger. And if Walter's story moved you, if it reminded you of your father, your neighbor, or even yourself, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and pass this story on to someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for spending a few minutes with us. Because sometimes it's the quietest stories that hold the loudest truths. And even when the system breaks down, people still have the power to rise and to remind the world what humanity looks like.